I was 8 centimeters dilated, gripping my husband's hand in a hospital delivery room when my phone buzzed with a photo from my neighbor. It showed a moving truck backed into my driveway and my mother-in-law directing 2 men carrying a dresser through my own front door. While I was bringing my daughter into the world, my in-laws were letting themselves into my house with a spare key they were never supposed to have and quietly changing the locks behind them. They thought a hospital bed would keep me too distracted to notice what they were doing. They had no idea that the house they were moving into wasn't legally theirs to touch, and that I had already made sure of it, months before they ever tried. My name is Emily. I'm 29, and before I ever met my husband, Jason, I bought a small 3-bedroom house on a quiet street with money I'd saved for 6 years working as a dental hygienist and picking up every overtime shift I could get. I skipped vacations, drove a car with almost 200,000 miles on it, and lived with 2 roommates well into my mid-20s just to keep saving. I put the deed in my name alone because at the time I was single, and it never occurred to me that keeping it that way would matter so much later. It just felt natural since every dollar of the down payment had come from my own account, built 1 overtime shift at a time. Jason and I met 2 years after I bought the house, fell in love the ordinary, unremarkable way people do at a mutual friend's barbecue over a conversation about, of all things, terrible dental puns. We dated for a year, got engaged, and got married 18 months after we met. He moved in with me and we built a life together in that house, painting the nursery yellow when we found out I was pregnant, planting a garden in the backyard, building the kind of quiet, steady life I'd always wanted. Jason was, in most ways, a genuinely good partner, thoughtful, funny, easy to talk to. The one place he consistently struggled was standing up to his mother, a pattern I noticed early but told myself wasn't serious enough to worry about. Jason's parents, Carol and Frank, had never fully warmed to me. Carol, in particular, had a habit of referring to the house as Jason's house in conversation, even though everyone at the table knew perfectly well whose name was on the paperwork. I used to correct her gently at first, and eventually I just stopped bothering because it never seemed to land anyway. Frank was quieter, mostly following Carol's lead, the same way Jason often did when it came to his mother. About a year before I got pregnant, Frank lost his job when the manufacturing plant he'd worked at for over 20 years closed down unexpectedly. Carol and Frank had never been great savers, and within a few months they were behind on their mortgage. Jason, being an only child, felt responsible in a way I understood, even if I didn't always agree with how far that responsibility should stretch. We helped them with a few mortgage payments here and there, quietly, the way you help family when you can. But by the time I was 6 months pregnant, Carol had started dropping hints more and more directly about moving in with us just until things stabilized. I told Jason, clearly and more than once, that I wasn't comfortable with his parents moving into our house permanently, especially not with a newborn coming. It wasn't that I didn't care about them struggling. It was that I knew, from small comments Carol had already made, that just until things stabilized would quietly become, indefinitely, the moment they were through the front door. Jason agreed with me, at least out loud, and told his parents more than once that it wasn't the right time. Carol never really accepted no as an answer. She had a way of nodding along in the moment and then bringing the same request back a few weeks later, slightly reframed as if the conversation had never happened. At one Sunday dinner, she brought up the space situation 3 separate times over the course of a single meal, each time in a slightly different way, testing to see if a different angle might land better than the last. About 6 weeks before my due date, Jason and I had a long conversation one night about the house, prompted by nothing in particular except a growing unease I couldn't quite explain. I told him I wanted to add something simple to our estate planning while we still had time before the baby came, just basic paperwork clarifying that the house remained solely in my name, along with a clear written agreement about who did and didn't have any legal right to occupy it. Jason, to his credit, didn't push back. He signed a document confirming he had no independent ownership claim to the house beyond what our marriage already legally protected for him, and more importantly, we both signed a formal notice, drafted by a real estate attorney, stating explicitly that no one besides the 2 of us and our child had any right to reside in the home without written permission from me, the sole owner on the deed. I remember feeling a little silly doing it at the time, like I was preparing for something that would never actually happen. Jason's family had never done anything I could point to as clearly wrong, nothing dramatic, nothing I could have taken to a lawyer with confidence before that point. It was more a collection of small, uneasy feelings, the kind you can't always justify out loud but can't quite ignore either. I'm grateful now, more than I can say, that I listened to that feeling instead of talking myself out of it. 3 weeks before my due date, Carol asked Jason for a spare key to the house, saying she wanted to start bringing over a few things so she could help out easily once the baby arrived. Jason, without asking me first, gave her one. When I found out, I was upset, not because I thought she'd do anything drastic with it, but because it went directly against a conversation we'd already had about boundaries. Jason apologized and told me he'd get the key back before the baby came. He never got the chance to. My water broke 2 days early, on a Tuesday afternoon, while Jason was at work and I was folding tiny onesies on our bed. I called him, we drove to the hospital together, and what followed was 17 hours of labor that felt, at different points, like it would never end and like it was happening far too fast all at once. My mother had passed away 3 years earlier, so it was just Jason with me through most of it, along with a labor and delivery nurse named Rosa who kept telling me every hour or so that I was doing better than I thought I was. Somewhere around hour 12, exhausted and barely tracking time, I got a text from our next-door neighbor, Denise, a retired school teacher who'd lived next to us for years and always kept a friendly eye on the street. "Everything okay?" she wrote. "There's a moving truck at your place and I saw Carol directing some guys carrying furniture inside. Just wanted to check before I said anything to them." Attached was a photo, slightly blurry, clearly taken from her front window, showing a rented moving truck backed into our driveway and my mother-in-law standing beside it with her arms crossed, pointing toward the front door. I remember staring at that message for a long moment, contractions rolling through me, trying to make sense of what I was reading. Part of me, in that exhausted, disoriented state, genuinely wondered if I was misreading it, if maybe Carol was just dropping off a gift for the baby. I called Denise instead of texting back, and she confirmed what the photo already showed. A moving truck, 2 men, a dresser, several boxes, and Carol standing in my driveway giving directions like she'd done it 100 times before. Jason, sitting beside my hospital bed, called his mother immediately, his voice sharper than I'd ever heard it. Carol answered breezily, telling him not to worry about a thing, that she and Frank were just getting settled into the guest room a little early, so they'd be ready to help the moment we brought the baby home. When Jason asked how she'd gotten in, she said simply, "I still have the keys, sweetheart. And honestly, it's easier for everyone if we're already set up before you two get home with the baby." I gave birth to our daughter, Grace, 4 hours later, in a state of exhaustion I can barely describe, made heavier by the knowledge that my in-laws were, at that exact moment, unpacking their belongings into my house without my permission. Jason wanted to leave the hospital immediately and confront them in person. I asked him not to, partly because I needed him there with me and our newborn, and partly because some calm, exhausted part of my brain was already thinking 2 steps ahead. I asked him to call our real estate attorney instead, the same one who had drafted the ownership documents 6 weeks earlier, and explain exactly what was happening. Our attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Patricia Ruiz, listened to the situation and told Jason something that made my exhausted relief almost physical. Because the house was solely in my name, and because we had a signed, dated document explicitly stating that no one besides Jason, myself, and our child had any right to occupy the home without my written permission, what Carol and Frank were doing wasn't a family disagreement. Legally, it was closer to unauthorized occupation of private property, and because they'd moved belongings in without consent, it could be treated formally as such if it came to that. Patricia said she could have a formal notice drafted and delivered that same day, giving them a clear deadline to remove their belongings and vacate the property, backed by the paperwork we'd already signed. She also asked, gently, whether we wanted to involve local police as a precaution when the notice was delivered, given that Carol had already shown she was willing to act without permission. Jason, still sitting in the hospital room with our newborn daughter sleeping in his arms, said he didn't think it would come to that, but he appreciated her asking. I stayed in the hospital for 2 more days with Grace, partly for recovery, partly honestly, because I didn't want my first days with my newborn daughter to be spent standing in my own driveway arguing with my in-laws. Those 2 days were strange, suspended somewhere between the exhaustion of new motherhood and a low, constant hum of anger I kept trying to set aside so I could focus on Grace instead. Jason went back and forth between my hospital room and phone calls with Patricia, updating me each time in a quiet, careful voice, like he was worried the stress might affect my recovery. I told him more than once that watching him actually stand firm this time was doing more for my recovery than anything else could have. Patricia had the notice delivered to the house the next morning. According to Denise, who watched the whole thing unfold from her front porch with what she later admitted was slightly inappropriate curiosity, Carol answered the door, read the notice, and immediately called Jason, her voice loud enough that Denise could hear pieces of it from her yard. Carol accused us of ambushing her during a family emergency, of caring more about paperwork than about helping Frank through a difficult time. Jason, to my genuine surprise and relief, didn't back down. He told her calmly that helping them financially had never meant giving up our home, and that moving in without asking, while I was in labor, wasn't help. It was a decision made specifically because they knew I couldn't stop them in that moment. Carol and Frank moved their things back out over the following 2 days, slower than the notice technically required, and clearly hoping we'd soften and let them stay if they simply delayed long enough. We didn't. Jason changed the locks himself the day we came home from the hospital, the actual, legitimate change of locks that should have happened, rather than the one Carol had planned to make permanent under different circumstances. He also asked Carol directly for the spare key back, along with any copies she might have made, something we later confirmed through the locksmith we used, since he was able to tell us the original lock hadn't been rekeyed by anyone else in the time Carol had access to it, which meant thankfully there weren't unknown copies floating around. The weeks that followed were tense in a way I hadn't experienced with Jason's family before. Carol called several times, alternating between hurt and anger, telling Jason I'd turned him against his own parents, and that I clearly didn't consider them real family if I was willing to have a lawyer send them a legal notice. One evening she called the house phone directly, something she almost never did, and left a long voicemail while I sat feeding Grace in the nursery, listening to it play through the speaker in the next room. In it, she said she'd raised Jason to believe family helps family, no matter what, and that she never imagined a daughter-in-law would weaponize a piece of paper against people who only wanted to help with their grandchild. I understood in a distant, exhausted way why she felt hurt. I also understood, more clearly than I ever had before, that her hurt had never once considered how I might have felt coming home from labor to find my in-laws already unpacked in my guest room, having decided among themselves that my consent was a formality they could skip if the timing was inconvenient enough for me to fight back. Frank, to his credit, called about 2 weeks later on his own without Carol on the line. He apologized, genuinely, in a way that surprised me. He said he'd gone along with Carol's plan because he felt ashamed of their financial situation and desperate for a solution that didn't require admitting out loud how bad things had gotten. He told me that watching the moving truck pull away from our driveway 2 days after the notice arrived had been one of the more humbling moments of his life, and that some part of him had known, even while he was carrying boxes into our house, that it wasn't right. He said he understood now that desperation didn't make what they'd done acceptable, and that he was sorry it had happened the way it did. During the 1 week of my life I most needed to feel safe in my own home. I told him I appreciated the apology and that I hoped they'd find a stable path forward, but that trust at this point would have to be rebuilt slowly on different terms than before. Jason and I sat down with a financial counselor a month later, and we agreed together on a fixed, modest amount we could reasonably contribute toward his parents' mortgage each month, clearly structured with clear boundaries and absolutely no housing arrangement attached to it. The counselor, a calm, practical man named Greg, walked us through setting up a separate account just for that purpose, so the contribution stayed predictable and never quietly grew the way informal family help so often does. Carol resisted the new terms at first, calling them cold and transactional, but eventually accepted them mostly, I think, because the alternative was losing the financial help altogether. Frank, notably, thanked us for the structure, telling Jason privately that having a clear number each month instead of an open-ended favor actually made it easier for him to accept the help without feeling like it was charity. It's been 5 months now since Grace was born. She's a happy, easy baby, and our house feels once again entirely like our own, filled with baby gear and half-finished cups of coffee and the ordinary chaos of new parenthood, instead of someone else's furniture in rooms that were never offered to them. Carol and Frank visit occasionally, briefly, respectfully, always calling ahead now, always waiting to be let in through a door I know, for certain only opens with keys I control. Denise still checks in on us sometimes, half joking that she's earned an honorary role as our unofficial security system, and honestly I think she's earned that title. Jason and I talk more openly now than we used to about where his loyalty to his parents ends and his responsibility to our own family begins. It's not a conversation that fixed itself overnight, and there are still moments where I can see him hesitate before pushing back on something Carol says. But he catches himself faster now, and more often than not, he catches himself before I even have to say anything. What I learned from that week is something I don't think I'll ever forget. Family can absolutely need help, and helping them is a choice worth making with an open heart. But need does not create a right, and desperation does not excuse deciding, on someone else's behalf, that their boundaries are simply inconvenient obstacles to work around while they're too vulnerable to stop you. Carol assumed that a hospital bed and 17 hours of labor would be the perfect cover for a decision she already knew I'd never approve of. She never imagined that the quiet, silly paperwork I'd signed 6 weeks earlier would be the exact thing that sent her right back out my front door. I want to know what you would have done in my place. Would you have let it go to keep the peace with your in-laws, or would you have done exactly what I did? Let me know in the comments below, and if this story hit home for you, make sure to like this video, drop a comment, and subscribe to True Life Drama, because there are a lot more stories like this one coming every week. Thanks so much for watching until the very end, and I'll see you in the next story.